Tom Bradley had always believed that a man's home was his castle. For the past 12 years, his castle had been a beautiful 40-acre ranch tucked away in the rolling hills of Texas. The property wasn't fancy, but it was everything he had ever wanted. Wide open spaces, tall oak trees that had been growing for decades, and best of all, a crystal-clear lake that sparkled in the morning sun. The lake was Tom's pride and joy. It covered about 3 acres and was fed by a natural spring that kept the water clean year-round. His grandfather had dug it back in 1967 when Tom was just a boy, using an old bulldozer and a lot of determination. Tom still remembered helping his grandfather stock it with bass and catfish, throwing the small fish into the water and watching them disappear into the depths. Every morning, Tom would walk down to the lake with his coffee and watch the sun come up. The water was so still it looked like a mirror, reflecting the sky and clouds perfectly. Sometimes he would see a great blue heron standing at the water's edge, waiting patiently for fish. Other times, a family of ducks would paddle by, leaving small ripples in their wake. Tom wasn't a wealthy man. He worked as a mechanic in town, fixing trucks and farm equipment for local ranchers. But out here on his land, he felt like the richest person in the world. He had everything he needed: a comfortable house that he had renovated himself over the years, a workshop where he could tinker with old engines, and enough space to breathe without anyone bothering him. The best part about the property was how quiet it was. The nearest neighbor had been old Pete Johnson, who lived about half a mile away and mostly kept to himself. Pete had passed away 3 years ago, and his family had sold the land to some developer from the city. For a while, nothing happened. The land just sat there covered in tall grass and wildflowers. Tom didn't mind being alone. He had his dog, Rex, a friendly golden retriever who loved swimming in the lake almost as much as Tom loved fishing in it. Rex would bound into the water every morning, chasing after sticks and splashing around like a puppy, even though he was already 8 years old. On weekends, Tom's brother Danny would come out with his kids. They would spend hours fishing from the old wooden dock that Tom had built himself. The kids loved catching bluegill and bass, and Tom loved teaching them how to bait their hooks and cast their lines. His nephew Jake, who was 10 years old, had become quite the little fisherman. He could cast a line better than most adults. The dock wasn't much to look at, just some weathered boards and metal posts, but it was solid and safe. Tom had built it to last, using marine-grade lumber and galvanized bolts. He had even installed a small bench where people could sit and watch the water. Sometimes local kids would ride their bikes out to the property and ask if they could fish. Tom never said no. He figured the lake was big enough for everyone. During the summer months, Tom would host barbecues for his friends and family. They would set up tables under the big oak tree by the water and cook burgers and hot dogs on his old charcoal grill. The kids would swim and play while the adults sat in lawn chairs, drinking beer and talking about everything and nothing. Those were some of Tom's favorite memories. Tom had always been the kind of neighbor that people could count on. When Mrs. Peterson's car broke down 2 winters ago, Tom had driven out in a snowstorm to jumpstart her battery. When the Martinez family needed help moving their furniture, Tom had loaded up his pickup truck and spent the whole day helping them. He believed in being neighborly, in looking out for each other. The property had one long gravel driveway that wound through the trees before opening up to reveal the house and lake. Tom liked it that way. The trees provided privacy and made the place feel secluded, like a secret hideaway. He had spent years clearing dead branches and maintaining the road, making sure it was passable even during heavy rains. His workshop sat behind the house, filled with tools and spare parts that he had collected over the years. Tom could fix almost anything with an engine. Neighbors would bring him their lawnmowers, generators, and even old motorcycles. He never charged much, just enough to cover parts. He enjoyed the work, enjoyed the challenge of figuring out what was wrong and making it right again. The house itself was nothing special from the outside, just a simple 2-story building with white siding and a red metal roof. But inside, Tom had made it his own. The living room had a big stone fireplace where he would burn oak logs during the winter. The kitchen overlooked the lake, so he could watch the water while he cooked his meals. His bedroom upstairs had windows on 3 sides, giving him a perfect view of his entire property. Tom had always assumed he would live out his days on this land. He pictured himself as an old man, still walking down to the lake every morning, still teaching kids how to fish, still maintaining the property with the same care and attention he had always given it. The land wasn't just his home. It was part of who he was. But all of that was about to change. About 6 months ago, construction crews had started showing up on Pete's old property. They began clearing trees and leveling the ground, preparing to build something new. Tom had watched from his porch as bulldozers pushed over the old fence line and survey crews marked property boundaries with bright orange flags. At first, Tom wasn't too worried. He figured someone was just building a house, maybe starting a small farm. The area had always been rural, and new families were welcome as long as they respected the peaceful way of life that everyone had come to love. The construction had been going on for months now, and Tom could see the framework of several houses going up. It looked like they were building an entire neighborhood where Pete's pasture used to be. Tom had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, he understood that people needed places to live. On the other hand, he worried about what kind of neighbors he would end up with. Rex had been curious about all the activity too. Sometimes he would stand at the property line, watching the workers and wagging his tail. Tom wondered what the dog thought about all the noise and commotion. For 12 years, this place had been their quiet sanctuary. Now change was coming whether they wanted it or not. The first family moved into the new development on a sunny Tuesday morning in March. Tom watched from his kitchen window as a moving truck pulled up to one of the completed houses. It was a big, modern-looking place with vinyl siding and a perfectly manicured lawn that had been installed just weeks before. The house looked out of place among the rolling hills and old oak trees, like someone had picked it up from a suburb and dropped it in the middle of ranch country. Tom didn't think much of it at first. New neighbors meant new possibilities for friendship. Maybe they would be the kind of people who appreciated the quiet country life. Maybe they would enjoy fishing or want to learn about the local wildlife. He decided to give them a few days to settle in before introducing himself. The woman who had moved in was named Linda Watson. Tom learned her name from the mailbox that appeared at the end of her driveway 3 days after she arrived. Linda was in her early 60s, recently retired from some kind of office job in the city. She had silver hair that was always perfectly styled and wore clothes that looked too nice for country living. Even when she was just checking her mail, she looked like she was dressed for a business meeting. Tom's first interaction with Linda came on a Saturday morning when he was mowing the grass around his lake. He was using his old riding mower, the same one he had been using for years. It was loud, sure, but it wasn't any louder than the tractors that other ranchers used on their property. Tom had always mowed early in the morning to avoid the heat of the day. Around 9 o'clock, he noticed a woman walking across the field toward him. As she got closer, he could see it was his new neighbor. She was waving her arms and looked upset about something. Tom shut off the mower and waited for her to reach him. "Excuse me," Linda said, slightly out of breath from walking across the uneven ground. "I'm Linda Watson, your new neighbor. I was wondering if you could possibly mow your lawn a little later in the day." "The noise woke me up this morning," Tom was surprised. 9 o'clock had never seemed early to him, especially on a Saturday. Most people in the area were up with the sun, taking care of their animals or working on their property. But he wanted to be a good neighbor. "Sure, I can do that," Tom said with a friendly smile. "I usually try to get it done before it gets too hot, but I can wait until 10 or 10:30 if that works better for you." Linda seemed pleased with his response, but then she looked around the property with a frown. Her eyes stopped on his workshop, which had various pieces of equipment and spare parts visible through the open doors. "Is this some kind of business you're running here?" she asked. Tom laughed. "No, ma'am. I just fix things for neighbors sometimes. Mostly just hobby work." "Well, it looks very commercial," Linda said, choosing her words carefully. "I hope you're not planning to expand it. We moved here for the peace and quiet." That comment rubbed Tom the wrong way, but he kept his tone friendly. "I've been doing the same thing for 12 years. Never had any complaints before." Linda didn't say anything else, just nodded and walked back to her house. Tom watched her go, wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Linda's attitude bothered him. She had been living there for less than a week and was already trying to change how he lived on his own property. Over the next few weeks, more families moved into the development. Most of them seemed nice enough. Tom met a young couple with 2 small children who were excited about living in the country. He also met a retired teacher who loved birds and was thrilled to learn about all the wildlife in the area. But Linda was different. She seemed to appoint herself as the spokesperson for the entire neighborhood, even though there were only 6 houses built so far. She started organizing meetings in her living room, talking about property values and community standards. Tom wasn't invited to these meetings, but he heard about them from other neighbors. The trouble really started when Tom decided to sell a small piece of his property. He had been thinking about it for months. The land along the eastern edge of his lake was beautiful, but he didn't really use it for anything. It was about 2 acres of gently sloping ground with a perfect view of the water. Tom figured that selling it would give him some extra money for retirement, and maybe bring in a neighbor who would appreciate the natural beauty of the area. Tom had always been a practical man. He didn't see any point in hiring a real estate agent and paying commission when he could handle the sale himself. He made a simple sign that said "For sale by owner" and included his phone number. The sign was nothing fancy, just black letters on a white background mounted on 2 metal posts. He drove the posts into the ground near the water's edge, where people driving by could easily see it. The spot was right at the corner of his property, clearly on his side of the boundary line. Tom had checked his property survey to make sure he was well within his rights. The sign had been up for exactly 3 days when Linda came marching across the field again. This time she wasn't alone. She had brought another woman from the development, someone Tom hadn't met yet. "Mr. Bradley," Linda said, her voice sharp with irritation. "We need to talk about that sign you put up." Tom had been working in his garden, planting tomatoes for the summer. He stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "What about it?" "It's completely inappropriate," Linda said. "This is a residential area, not some commercial district. That sign is bringing down our property values." The other woman nodded in agreement. "We didn't move out here to look at advertising signs." Tom felt his patience starting to wear thin. "It's on my property, and I have every right to sell my land, if I want to. But there must be rules about this kind of thing," Linda insisted. "You can't just put up any sign you want. What if everyone started doing that?" "Everyone has the right to sell their own property," Tom said calmly. "That's how you ended up living here in the first place." Linda's face turned red. "That's completely different. Our development was professionally planned and marketed. You're just being disruptive." Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had lived on this land for 12 years without any problems. Now, after less than a month, his new neighbor was trying to tell him what he could and couldn't do on his own property. "The sign stays," Tom said firmly. "If you don't like looking at it, you can plant some trees." Linda and her friend left in a huff, but Tom could tell this wasn't over. He had dealt with unreasonable people before, but something about Linda's attitude suggested she wasn't going to let this go. Sure enough, 2 days later, Tom got a visit from the county code enforcement officer. Officer Jenkins was a reasonable man who had known Tom for years. He looked embarrassed as he explained why he was there. "I got a complaint about a sign," Jenkins said. "Someone says you're running an unauthorized business." Tom showed Jenkins the sign and explained that he was simply trying to sell part of his property. Jenkins looked at the sign, checked his notes, and shook his head. "This is perfectly legal," Jenkins said. "Property owners have the right to sell their land and advertise it how they see fit. Whoever called this in doesn't know what they're talking about." But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next week, Tom received visits from the sheriff's department, the fire marshal, and even a representative from the state environmental agency. Each time the complaint had come from the same source, and each time the officials found nothing wrong. Linda had started a war, and Tom was beginning to realize that his peaceful life on the ranch was about to become a lot more complicated. Deputy Rodriguez had been working in the county sheriff's department for 8 years, and he thought he had seen everything. But when he got the call about an illegal real estate operation on Bradley Road, he knew he was dealing with something unusual. The complaint had come in at exactly 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and the caller had been very specific about the alleged violations. "There's a man running an unlicensed real estate business," the woman on the phone had said. "He's got signs up everywhere, and he's clearly violating zoning laws. This is supposed to be a quiet residential area." Deputy Rodriguez drove out to Tom Bradley's property, taking his time on the winding country road. He had been out this way before, mostly for minor issues like livestock getting loose or complaints about hunting during the wrong season. The Bradley place had never been a problem. When he pulled into Tom's driveway, the first thing he noticed was how peaceful everything looked. The lake sparkled in the morning sun, and an old golden retriever came trotting up to greet him, tail wagging. This didn't look like the scene of any criminal activity. Tom came out of his workshop, wiping grease off his hands with a red rag. He looked confused when he saw the patrol car. "Morning, Deputy," Tom said. "Everything okay?" "Got a complaint about some signs," Rodriguez said, feeling a little foolish. "Someone says you're running a business without proper permits." Tom laughed and shook his head. "You mean my for sale sign? Come on, I'll show you." They walked over to the lake, where the simple white sign stood near the water's edge. Rodriguez read it carefully. "For sale by owner, 2 acres lakefront property," followed by Tom's phone number. It was clearly on Tom's side of the property line, and it was certainly nothing that would violate any laws. "This is it?" Rodriguez asked. "That's it," Tom confirmed. "Just trying to sell a piece of my land. Been thinking about it for months." Rodriguez made some notes in his report and shook his head. "Well, there's nothing illegal about this. Property owners have the right to sell their land and advertise it however they want as long as it's on their own property." "That's what I figured," Tom said. "But apparently my new neighbor sees things differently." Rodriguez didn't need to ask who the neighbor was. He had a pretty good idea based on the tone of the complaint call. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Mr. Bradley. You're not breaking any laws." But Linda Watson wasn't satisfied with the deputy's findings. 2 days later, she called the sheriff's department again, this time claiming that Tom was operating a commercial campground without proper licenses. She said she had photographic evidence of multiple people staying on the property overnight. This time, Sheriff Morrison himself decided to check things out. He had known Tom for years and couldn't imagine him running any kind of illegal operation. But complaints had to be investigated. Sheriff Morrison arrived on a Saturday afternoon to find Tom hosting his monthly family barbecue. Tom's brother Danny was there with his kids, along with a few other relatives and friends. They had set up some folding tables under the big oak tree, and someone had brought a volleyball net for the kids to play with. "Looks like a nice family gathering," Sheriff Morrison said as Tom walked over to greet him. "Just the usual weekend barbecue," Tom replied. "My nephew caught 3 bass this morning and we're going to cook them up for lunch." Sheriff Morrison looked around at the scene. Kids were playing in the lake while adults sat in lawn chairs drinking soda and talking. It was about as wholesome as family gatherings got. "I hate to bother you with this," the sheriff said, "but I got another complaint. Someone says you're running a campground out here." Tom's face darkened. "A campground? Sheriff, these are my family and friends. We've been doing this for years." "I know," Sheriff Morrison said, "and there's nothing wrong with it. But I have to follow up on complaints, even the ridiculous ones." The sheriff stayed for a few minutes, chatting with Tom's relatives and watching the kids play. Before he left, he pulled Tom aside. "Listen, you might want to be careful about your neighbor," he said quietly. "She's called us 3 times this week about various things. Tree branches hanging over property lines, noise complaints, now this. Some people just like to stir up trouble." Tom thanked the sheriff, but he was starting to feel frustrated. He had lived peacefully on his property for 12 years, never bothering anyone, always trying to be a good neighbor. Now he was dealing with constant complaints and visits from law enforcement officers who were just doing their jobs but clearly didn't want to be there. Linda's campaign escalated when she started taking photographs. Tom first noticed her standing at the edge of her property with a camera, pointing it in his direction. At first, he thought she might be taking pictures of the lake or the wildlife. But when he saw her crouched behind a tree with what looked like a telephoto lens, he realized she was documenting his activities. The photography continued for weeks. Linda would appear at different times of day, always with her camera, always trying to stay hidden. Tom felt like he was being watched constantly, and it made him uncomfortable on his own property. The situation got worse when Linda started involving other neighbors in her complaints. She organized meetings in her living room, showing her photographs, and talking about property values and community standards. She created a petition asking the county to investigate Tom's various illegal activities. Tom learned about the meetings from his neighbor, Jennifer, the retired teacher who lived 2 houses down from Linda. "I went to one of her meetings," Jennifer told Tom apologetically. "I wanted to see what she was so worked up about. She had all these pictures of your property, and she was talking like you were running some kind of criminal enterprise." "What did she say exactly?" Tom asked. "She claims you're operating a business without permits, that you're destroying the rural character of the area, and that your activities are bringing undesirable elements to the neighborhood. She even suggested that your dog might be dangerous." Tom couldn't believe it. Rex was the gentlest dog in the county, beloved by every child who had ever met him. The idea that anyone would consider him dangerous was absurd. But Linda's complaints kept coming. She called animal control, claiming that Rex was unlicensed and aggressive. When the animal control officer came out, he found Rex playing fetch with Tom in the front yard. The dog was properly licensed, up to date on all his shots, and clearly well-trained and friendly. "Somebody's been watching too many movies," the animal control officer told Tom. "This is one of the nicest dogs I've ever met." Linda also called the fire department, claiming that Tom was burning illegal materials in his backyard. The fire chief came out to find Tom burning brush and fallen branches in a metal burn barrel, something that was completely legal and that rural property owners did all the time. She called the health department, claiming that Tom's septic system was contaminating the lake. An inspector came out and found that Tom's system was in perfect working order and posed no threat to the environment. She even called the IRS, suggesting that Tom was operating a cash business and not paying proper taxes. That investigation took months and found nothing wrong with Tom's finances. Each false complaint cost Tom time and stress. He had to take time off work to meet with various officials. He had to gather documents and answer questions about activities that were perfectly legal and normal. He started to feel like he was under siege on his own property. The breaking point came when Linda called Child Protective Services, claiming that Tom was allowing children to engage in dangerous activities around the lake. A social worker came out during one of Tom's family barbecues and found kids wearing life jackets while swimming under adult supervision, exactly as they should be. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this," the social worker told Tom. "Whoever made this complaint clearly doesn't understand what responsible adult supervision looks like." Tom realized that Linda wasn't going to stop. She had made it her mission to drive him away from his own property, using every government agency she could think of to harass and intimidate him. But Tom Bradley had been dealing with difficult people his whole life, and he wasn't about to be pushed around by someone who had lived in the area for less than 3 months. It was time to fight back, but Tom was going to do it his way, using his brain instead of endless complaints to government agencies. He had a plan, and Linda Watson was about to learn that two could play the property game. Tom Bradley had always believed that the best defense was a good offense, but he also believed in fighting smart rather than fighting dirty. After months of dealing with Linda Watson's constant complaints and harassment, he decided it was time to do some research of his own. If Linda wanted to play games with property rights and regulations, Tom was going to make sure he understood the rules better than she did. The first thing Tom did was visit the county courthouse. He had been there before over the years, paying property taxes and handling various permits, but this time he was on a mission. He wanted to understand exactly how property ownership worked in his area, and more importantly, he wanted to learn everything he could about Linda's property and the development she lived in. The courthouse records were public information, available to anyone who wanted to look them up. Tom spent an entire Saturday afternoon going through files, making copies, and taking notes. What he discovered was very interesting. The Willowbrook Estates development had been built by Horizon Properties, a company that had run into financial trouble shortly after completing the first phase of construction. The original plan had called for 24 houses, but only 8 had been built before the company ran out of money. That left 16 empty lots, some of which were still owned by Horizon Properties, and others that had been sold to various investors. More importantly, Tom discovered that the entire development had been built on land that had originally been a working ranch, just like his property. The developers had carved up the land and created individual lots, but they had made some interesting decisions about roads and access rights. Linda's house, along with 3 others, was located in what the developers had called Phase 2 of the project. To reach these houses, residents had to drive through a privately owned lot that contained the main access road. Tom studied the property maps carefully and realized that this access road had never been officially dedicated as a public right-of-way. It was simply a private road that crossed private property. The lot that contained this crucial access road was listed as Lot 47 in the development plans. According to the courthouse records, Lot 47 was still owned by Horizon Properties, which was now in bankruptcy proceedings. The lot was described as unbuildable due to wetlands restrictions and was listed among the company's assets that were for sale. Tom felt a smile creeping across his face as he studied the maps. Lot 47 was a half-acre plot of land that most people would consider worthless. It was low-lying and soggy, not suitable for building a house or really doing much of anything with, but it was the only way for Linda and her neighbors to reach their homes without driving across someone else's property. Tom made some phone calls and learned that Horizon Properties was desperate to sell off its remaining assets to pay creditors. The company's bankruptcy attorney was eager to get rid of any properties that weren't generating income, especially ones that were considered unbuildable. "How much would you want for Lot 47?" Tom asked during his phone conversation with the attorney. "Honestly, we'd take any reasonable offer," the attorney replied. "That lot has been sitting on our books for 2 years. It's costing us money in property taxes, and we can't do anything with it because of the environmental restrictions." Tom knew he had to be careful not to seem too eager. "What would you consider a reasonable offer?" The lot was originally listed at $30,000, but we'd probably take $15,000 just to get it off our books. Tom told the attorney he would think about it and get back to him. But he had already made up his mind. For $15,000, he could own the one piece of property that would give him all the leverage he needed to deal with Linda Watson. Before making any moves, Tom decided to do some more research. He wanted to understand exactly what rights came with owning Lot 47, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't missing anything important. He hired a local attorney, someone who specialized in property law and understood the complexities of rural land ownership. Attorney Robert Chen was a practical man who had grown up in the area before going to law school in the city. He understood both the legal technicalities and the local customs that governed how neighbors dealt with each other. "This is interesting," Chen said as he studied the property maps and development documents that Tom had brought to his office. The developer created a private road system, but never established any formal easements or access rights. Technically, anyone who owns Lot 47 controls access to 4 houses in the development. "And that's legal?" Tom asked. "Perfectly legal," Chen confirmed. "When people buy property, they're responsible for making sure they have legal access to it. These buyers assumed they would always have access through Lot 47, but they never secured any written agreements." Chen explained that the residents of Linda's section could apply for an easement through the courts, but that would take time and money, and there was no guarantee they would get one. In the meantime, whoever owned Lot 47 had the right to control access to their property. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Chen asked. "Nothing illegal," Tom said, "but I think it's time for Linda to learn that property rights work both ways." Tom made the offer for Lot 47 the following Monday. The bankruptcy attorney accepted immediately. Clearly relieved to get the property off his company's books, the paperwork was handled quickly, and within 2 weeks Tom Bradley was the proud owner of a half-acre of swampy land that most people would consider worthless. The first thing Tom did was have the property properly surveyed. He wanted to know exactly where his new property lines were especially where they intersected with the private road that Linda and her neighbors used every day. The survey confirmed what he had suspected. The road ran directly through the middle of his new property. Tom also had the property's environmental restrictions reviewed by a specialist. The wetlands designation meant he couldn't build on the land or significantly alter its natural state, but it didn't prevent him from controlling access across it. He could put up a fence, post signs, or even install a gate, as long as he didn't disturb the underlying wetlands. While Tom was making his preparations, Linda continued her campaign of harassment. She had expanded her complaints to include Tom's unauthorized agricultural activities because he had a small vegetable garden, and his noise pollution because he occasionally used power tools in his workshop. Each complaint resulted in another visit from county officials, and each visit found no violations of any laws or regulations. Tom endured these continued harassments patiently, knowing that his patience would soon be rewarded. He spent his evenings planning exactly how he would handle the situation once his ownership of Lot 47 was officially recorded. The most important part of Tom's plan was timing. He wanted to make his move at a moment when it would have maximum impact, but he also wanted to make sure he did everything legally and properly. He didn't want to sink to Linda's level of petty harassment and false complaints. Tom decided to wait until Linda filed another frivolous complaint against him. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the Lot 47 sale was finalized, Linda called the county again, this time claiming that Tom was operating an unauthorized automotive repair business because his neighbor had brought over a lawnmower that wouldn't start. Deputy Rodriguez came out for what felt like the 100th time, investigated the complaint, and found nothing wrong. As he was leaving, he stopped to talk to Tom. "I don't know what her problem is," the deputy said, "but this has got to stop. We've got real crimes to investigate, and we're wasting time on these nonsense calls." "Don't worry," Tom said with a smile. "I think the problem is about to solve itself." That evening, Tom drove over to Lot 47 with a load of materials in his pickup truck. He had purchased 8-foot fence posts, chain link fencing, and several no trespassing signs from the hardware store in town. Working by the light of portable floodlights, Tom spent the night installing a fence across the access road that Linda and her neighbors had been using. The fence was perfectly legal. Tom had every right to control access to his own property, and he had been careful to place the fence entirely within his property lines. He even installed a gate in the fence, though he kept it locked with a heavy chain and padlock. As the sun came up, Tom put the finishing touches on his work. He posted signs clearly identifying the property as privately owned and warning that trespassers would be prosecuted. He also posted a sign with his phone number, inviting anyone who needed access to contact him to discuss arrangements. Then Tom went home, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat on his porch with Rex to wait for Linda to discover what had happened. He didn't have to wait long. Linda Watson had always been an early riser, but Tuesday morning brought her the rudest awakening of her life. She had planned to drive into town for her weekly grocery shopping, the same routine she had followed for the past 6 months since moving to Willowbrook Estates. She grabbed her purse, climbed into her silver sedan, and backed out of her driveway at exactly 8:15, just as she always did. But instead of the familiar smooth drive to the main road, Linda found herself facing something that made her slam on her brakes and stare in disbelief. Where the access road used to continue unobstructed toward the county highway, there was now a tall chain-link fence stretching across the entire width of the road. Linda sat in her car for a full minute, trying to process what she was seeing. The fence was clearly new, and it was definitely blocking her only way out of the neighborhood. Large signs were posted on the fence, warning that this was private property, and that trespassers would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. She got out of her car and walked up to the fence, reading the signs more carefully. One of them included a phone number and an invitation to call for access arrangements. The phone number looked familiar, and with a sinking feeling in her stomach, Linda realized it was Tom Bradley's number. Linda's first instinct was to call the sheriff's department, which had become her standard response to any problem in the neighborhood. She dialed 911 from her cell phone, reporting that someone had illegally blocked a public road. Ma'am, are you sure it's a public road? The dispatcher asked. Of course it's a public road, Linda snapped. How else would we get? To our houses? I'll send someone out to check on it, the dispatcher said. While Linda waited for the deputy to arrive, her neighbors from the other 3 houses in her section discovered the same problem. Jennifer, the retired teacher, was the first to come, walking down the road to see what was happening. What in the world is this? Jennifer asked, looking at the fence. That crazy man has blocked our road, Linda said, her voice rising with anger. This is illegal. You can't just block public roads. Are you sure it's a public road? Jennifer asked, echoing the dispatcher's question. Of course I'm sure, Linda insisted, though she was beginning to have doubts. Deputy Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later, looking tired and frustrated. He had been dealing with complaints from this neighborhood for months, and he had a pretty good idea what was going on. What seems to be the problem? He asked, though he could see the fence clearly enough. Someone has illegally blocked our road, Linda said. This is clearly against the law. Rodriguez walked over to examine the fence and the posted signs. He pulled out his phone and made a call to the county assessor's office, reading off the lot number from one of the signs. Ma'am, I've got some bad news for you, he said after finishing his call. This isn't a public road. It's a private road that runs through privately owned property. The owner has every right to control access. That's impossible, Linda protested. We've been using this road for months. Using it, yes, but apparently without any legal right to do so, Rodriguez explained. The property owner was letting you use his road out of courtesy, but he's not required to do that. Linda felt the ground shifting under her feet. But how are we supposed to get to our houses? That's something you'll need to work out with the property owner, Rodriguez said. There's nothing illegal about this fence. In fact, the owner has been very careful to follow all the proper procedures. After the deputy left, Linda found herself facing a reality she had never considered. She and her 3 neighbors were effectively trapped in their own neighborhood, with no legal way to reach the outside world except by walking across someone else's property. Linda swallowed her pride and called Tom's number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Bradley Residence, Tom said in a cheerful voice. This is Linda Watson. You've blocked our road. Good morning, Linda, Tom said politely. I've installed a fence around my property, yes? How can I help you? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Linda said, her voice tight with anger. You can't block our access to our homes. I'm not blocking anything, Tom replied calmly. I'm simply controlling access to my own property, which is my legal right. But I'd be happy to discuss some kind of arrangement. Linda gritted her teeth. What kind of arrangement? Well, since you and your neighbors need to cross my property to reach your homes, we'll need to work out an easement agreement. I've spoken with my attorney, and he says $50,000 would be a fair price for a permanent easement. Linda nearly dropped the phone. $50,000? That's insane. Actually, it's quite reasonable, Tom said. That's about what I've spent in legal fees, time off work, and stress dealing with all your complaints over the past few months. Plus, easements across waterfront property are quite valuable. I'm not paying you anything, Linda said. This is extortion. No, ma'am, this is business, Tom replied. You need something I own, and I'm willing to sell it to you at a fair price. You're free to look for alternative access to your property, or you can make me a counteroffer. Linda hung up the phone and immediately called her real estate agent, demanding to know why nobody had told her about this access issue when she bought her house. The agent explained that it had been assumed the access road would always be available, since it had been built by the original developer. But the developer went bankrupt, the agent explained. A lot of their holdings have been sold off to pay creditors. Linda spent the rest of the day making phone calls, trying to find some alternative solution. She called the county planning department, hoping they could force Tom to provide access. She called a lawyer, hoping she could sue him for blocking the road. She even called the original developer's bankruptcy attorney, hoping to undo Tom's purchase of the property. Every phone call brought the same response. Tom Bradley had acted completely within his rights, and Linda and her neighbors had no legal claim to access across his property. By evening, Linda was facing the reality that she would either have to pay Tom's price or find some other way to reach her house. The other option was to walk across his property every time she needed to leave. carrying her groceries and hoping he wouldn't have her arrested for trespassing. Jennifer, the retired teacher, came to Linda's house that evening with a practical suggestion. "Look, this is partly your fault," Jennifer said bluntly. "You've been harassing that man for months with frivolous complaints. Maybe if we approach him together and apologize, he might be more reasonable about the price." Linda didn't want to apologize for anything, but she was beginning to realize she didn't have much choice. The next morning, she swallowed her pride and called Tom again. "I'd like to discuss the easement," she said stiffly. "Of course," Tom replied. "Would you like to come over and talk about it? I'll unlock the gate so you can drive through." 20 minutes later, Linda found herself sitting at Tom's kitchen table, looking out at the lake that had been the source of so much conflict. Tom poured her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "I want you to know that I don't enjoy this situation," Tom said. "I've always tried to be a good neighbor, but you've made my life very difficult over the past few months." Linda wanted to argue, but she knew she was in no position to make demands. "What exactly do you want?" "I want to live peacefully on my property without constant harassment," Tom said. "I want to be able to sell my land, maintain my workshop, and have family barbecues without worrying about someone calling the police." "And the $50,000? Tom was quiet for a moment, studying Linda's face. "The money would compensate me for what this situation has cost me. But more importantly, it would ensure that you and your neighbors take this easement seriously. When people get something for free, they don't always respect it." Linda realized that Tom was offering her more than just access to her property. He was offering her a chance to end the conflict that had consumed both their lives for months. "I'll need to discuss it with my neighbors," Linda said. "Of course," Tom agreed. "But I should mention that my offer is only good for another week. After that, the price goes up." Linda and her neighbors pooled their resources and hired a lawyer to see if there were any alternatives to paying Tom's price. The lawyer confirmed what everyone else had told them. They were legally stuck, and $50,000 was actually a reasonable price for a permanent easement across lakefront property. A week later, Linda returned to Tom's kitchen table with a cashier's check. Tom's attorney was there with the easement documents, which guaranteed Linda and her neighbors permanent access across his property. As they signed the papers, Tom made one final comment. "You know, if you had just come to me as a neighbor from the beginning, instead of calling the authorities every time you had a problem, we probably could have worked everything out without any of this drama." Linda nodded, finally understanding that her approach had created the very problem she was now paying to solve. Tom used part of the money to take a long vacation, his first in years. When he returned, he found that his relationship with his neighbors had settled into something much more peaceful. Linda had learned to respect property boundaries, and the other residents had learned not to follow her lead in neighborhood disputes. The for sale sign by the lake attracted a young family who loved the idea of living near the water. They bought the 2 acres for a fair price and built a modest house with a perfect view of the lake. Unlike Linda, they understood that country living meant respecting your neighbors and their way of life. Rex, the golden retriever, continued to swim in the lake every morning, no longer worried about being reported as a dangerous animal. Tom continued to fix lawnmowers for his neighbors, host family barbecues, and live peacefully on the land that had been in his family for generations. And Linda Watson learned that sometimes the best way to be a good neighbor is to mind your own business.